Waitress showed an old letter. Millionaire realized it was his father's, then unbelievable happened. Before we begin, tell me something about where you live. What's the weather like today? The rain hammered against the windows of Romano's diner with relentless fury, creating rivers of water that distorted the neon signs across the street into abstract smears of color. Inside the cramped establishment, the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows across the worn vinyl booths and chipped formica tables. Marcus Blackwell pulled his expensive wool coat tighter around his shoulders, acutely aware of how out of place he looked in this forgotten corner of the city. His handmade Italian leather shoes squeaked against the sticky linoleum floor as he made his way to a corner booth, the sound jarring in the otherwise quiet diner. At 62, Marcus had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small construction company inherited from his adoptive father into Blackwell Industries, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that dominated the real estate market across 3 states. His steel gray hair was perfectly styled, his 3-piece suit impeccable despite the weather, and his piercing blue eyes held the calculating gaze of a man who had spent decades evaluating people's worth in mere seconds. Yet tonight, something felt different. Tonight, he wasn't here as the Marcus Blackwell whose face graced the covers of financial magazines, whose every business decision sent ripples through the stock market. Tonight, he was simply a man seeking answers to questions that had haunted him for over 4 decades. The diner held only a handful of patrons at this late hour, an elderly man hunched over a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, a young couple sharing a piece of pie with the desperate intimacy of people who couldn't afford to eat anywhere else, and a trucker whose eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. Behind the counter, a woman in her mid-40s moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent countless years serving others. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, wisps escaping to frame a face that spoke of both kindness and hard-won wisdom. Her uniform, though clean, showed the signs of countless washings, and her hands bore the calluses of honest work. Marcus had come here not by chance, but by design. For months, he had been conducting what he privately called his humanity experiments, elaborate tests designed to determine whether genuine kindness still existed in a world that seemed increasingly driven by greed and self-interest. He would disguise himself as a person in need, sometimes as a homeless veteran, other times as a struggling single parent, and observe how people reacted. The results had been disappointing, confirming his cynical worldview that most people were ultimately selfish creatures who would only help others if there was something in it for them. But something about this place, something about the woman behind the counter, had drawn him here on this stormy night. Marcus Blackwell's journey to this moment had begun 62 years ago in circumstances he had spent a lifetime trying to understand. Found abandoned as an infant on the steps of St. Catherine's children's home, he had no memories of his biological parents, no photographs, no keepsakes, nothing but a worn envelope containing his birth certificate and a brief note from someone claiming to be his father. The note, written in shaky handwriting, had simply said, "I hope someday you'll understand why I had to let you go. You deserve better than what I can give you. Find your own way, son. Make something of yourself." It was signed simply JB and dated the day Marcus was born. The children's home had been a harsh place, run by strict nuns who believed that discipline and order were the keys to molding proper citizens. Marcus had learned early that the world was divided into the strong and the weak, the providers and the provided for, the ones who made decisions and those who lived with the consequences. When he was 8 years old, Thomas and Helen Blackwell, a childless couple in their 40s, had adopted him. Thomas owned a small construction company that barely scraped by, but he was a good man who worked with his hands and believed in earning an honest living. Helen was a schoolteacher who filled their modest home with books and the smell of fresh-baked bread. For the first time in his young life, Marcus had felt what it meant to be wanted, to be part of a family. Thomas had taught him the value of hard work, showing him how to read blueprints, how to calculate materials, how to manage a crew of workers who respected him despite his modest success. Helen had nurtured his sharp mind, encouraging his love of mathematics and reading, helping him understand that knowledge was a form of power that no one could ever take away from him. They had loved him unconditionally, never making him feel like anything less than their natural son, never treating his adoption as anything other than a blessing that had brought them together. But even surrounded by love and stability, Marcus had never been able to shake the questions that plagued him about his origins. Who was JB? Why had his biological father abandoned him? What circumstances had been so dire that giving up his son had seemed like the only option? As he grew older, these questions became an obsession that colored every aspect of his life. He threw himself into his studies, determined to become successful enough that no one would ever abandon him again. He graduated valedictorian from high school, earned a full scholarship to Harvard Business School, and returned home with plans to transform his adoptive father's small construction company into something magnificent. Thomas had been proud, but also worried about his son's relentless ambition. "Son," he had said one evening as they sat on the porch of their modest home, watching the sun set over the neighborhood where Marcus had grown up, "success is important, but it's not everything. Don't lose sight of what really matters: family, community, helping others when you can. Money comes and goes, but the relationships you build, the lives you touch, that's what lasts." Marcus had listened politely, but inside he had disagreed. In his experience, relationships were transactional. People helped others only when it benefited them, and the only security in life came from having enough wealth and power that you never had to depend on anyone else's kindness. When Thomas died of a heart attack 5 years later, Marcus inherited the construction company and began his methodical transformation of it into an empire. He expanded aggressively, bought out competitors, developed luxury condominiums and shopping centers that generated enormous profits. Within a decade, he was a millionaire. Within 2 decades, he was worth hundreds of millions. But success had come at a cost. Helen had died 3 years after Thomas, and Marcus found himself alone in a world of his own making. He had acquaintances and business associates, but no real friends. He had been married twice, both relationships ending, when his wives realized that his work would always come first, that his need to control every aspect of his environment extended to his personal relationships as well. He lived in a penthouse apartment that was featured in architectural magazines, drove cars that cost more than most people made in a year, and owned properties around the world. But he went to bed each night, feeling empty and disconnected from everyone around him. It was this emptiness that had led him to begin his humanity experiments 2 years ago. If genuine kindness and altruism were dead, if everyone was ultimately motivated by self-interest, then at least he would have confirmation that his cynical worldview was correct. He would know that his isolation was justified, that his inability to form meaningful connections was simply a realistic response to the way the world actually worked. But if he found evidence of genuine goodness, if he discovered people who were willing to help others without expecting anything in return, then perhaps there was hope, not just for humanity, but for him as well. His experiments had taken many forms. He had posed as a homeless veteran outside office buildings where his own companies were headquartered, testing whether his employees would show compassion to someone they thought was a stranger. Most had walked past without acknowledgement, too absorbed in their phones or their own concerns to notice his presence. He had pretended to be a struggling single father at upscale grocery stores, counting out food stamps and watching to see if anyone would offer to help pay for his children's food. A few people had given him sympathetic looks, but no one had stepped forward with assistance. He had staged car breakdowns in affluent neighborhoods, hoping to see if anyone would stop to help a stranded motorist. Occasionally, someone would pull over, but invariably they would offer to call a tow truck rather than getting their hands dirty helping a stranger. Each experiment had reinforced his belief that people were fundamentally selfish, that kindness was a luxury that disappeared when it required any real sacrifice or inconvenience. But tonight felt different. Tonight, as he sat in this humble diner with rain streaking the windows and the smell of coffee and pie filling the air, Marcus found himself hoping that his cynicism would finally be proven wrong. He had chosen this place deliberately after weeks of observation. Romano's diner was located in one of the city's transitional neighborhoods, not quite gentrified, but no longer truly rough. The customers were working-class people, the kind his adoptive father would have felt comfortable among. Construction workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts, nurses getting off late shifts at the nearby hospital, elderly residents on fixed incomes treating themselves to an occasional meal out. The waitress approached his table with a coffee pot and a warm smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. "Good evening, hun. Terrible weather to be out and about. What can I get you started with tonight?" Ooh, her voice carried the slight accent of someone who had grown up in the Midwest, with the kind of warmth that made customers feel like they were visiting a favorite aunt rather than being served by a stranger. Marcus studied her face carefully, looking for signs of the calculated friendliness he had encountered in so many of his previous experiments. But there was something different about this woman, something in her eyes that suggested she saw each customer as an individual worthy of attention rather than simply another transaction to be completed efficiently. Her name tag read Elena, and she wore it with the same quiet dignity that seemed to permeate everything about her presence. "Just coffee for now," Marcus replied, modulating his voice to hide the cultured tones that would immediately mark him as someone who didn't belong in this environment. "I'm not sure I'm ready to eat yet." Eleanor filled his cup with practiced precision, the coffee dark and strong enough to cut through the chill that seemed to have settled in his bones during the drive across town. "No problem at all. The pot's fresh, and I'll keep an eye on your cup. You take your time deciding. We're not in any hurry here." She paused, seeming to genuinely assess his comfort. "You look like you might be having a rough night. Sometimes it helps just to have a warm place to sit and think things through." The simple observation caught Marcus off guard. In all his experiments, no service worker had ever looked past his immediate request to consider what he might actually need. Most barely made eye contact, focused on completing their tasks efficiently and moving on to the next customer. But Elena seemed to see him as a person, rather than simply a function to be fulfilled, and the recognition stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," he said quietly, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "It has been a difficult evening." Elena nodded sympathetically but didn't pry, respecting his privacy while making it clear that he was welcome to stay as long as he needed. As she moved away to check on her other customers, Marcus found himself observing her interactions with a growing sense of fascination. With the elderly man hunched over his cold coffee, she brought a fresh cup without being asked and spent a few moments chatting about his grandson's recent graduation from high school. With the young couple sharing pie, she discreetly refilled their water glasses and brought extra napkins without drawing attention to their obvious financial constraints. With the exhausted trucker, she offered recommendations for nearby motels and slipped an extra packet of crackers onto his table. Each interaction was brief but genuine, conducted with a level of care and attention that suggested Elena truly cared about the well-being of every person who walked through the diner's doors. This wasn't the perfunctory service Marcus was accustomed to receiving in high-end restaurants, where waiters fawned over him because they knew he was wealthy enough to leave substantial tips. This was something else entirely, a quality of human connection that he had almost convinced himself no longer existed in the modern world. As the evening progressed, the diner gradually emptied until only Marcus remained, nursing his third cup of coffee and trying to work up the courage to begin the test he had come here to conduct. Elena continued her closing duties, wiping down tables and refilling salt shakers, but she made no attempt to rush him out despite the late hour. When she passed his table, she would refresh his coffee and ask if he needed anything else, but she never made him feel like an inconvenience or a burden. Finally, as the clock above the counter approached midnight, Marcus knew he had to act. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope that had been carefully aged and distressed to look like it had been carried around for decades. Inside was a letter he had written and rewritten dozens of times, designed to test the limits of Elena's compassion and integrity. "Excuse me," he called softly as Elena passed his table carrying a tray of clean glasses. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wonder if I could ask for your help with something." Elena immediately set down her tray and turned toward him with the kind of focused attention that suggested he had her complete consideration. "Of course, hon. What do you need?" Marcus held up the envelope, his hands trembling slightly, partly from nervousness about the deception he was about to attempt, and partly from genuine emotion at the kindness he had already witnessed. "I've been carrying this letter around for 40 years, he began, his voice thick with what wasn't entirely feigned emotion. "It's from my father, the only thing I have left of him. I've read it so many times that it's falling apart, and I'm afraid I'm going to lose it completely." He opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a piece of paper that had been aged with tea stains and worn soft at the creases from repeated folding. The letter was written in the same shaky handwriting as the original note from his biological father, but the content was far more elaborate. A fictional deathbed confession from a man apologizing for a lifetime of mistakes and expressing his love for the son he had been forced to abandon. "I don't have much money," Marcus continued, the words feeling strange in his mouth after decades of never having to worry about financial constraints. "But I was wondering if you might know someone who could make a copy of this letter, or maybe help me preserve it somehow. I know it's a lot to ask a stranger, but I don't have anyone else to turn to, and you seem like someone who might understand how important this is to me." Elena's expression shifted as she looked at the worn letter in his hands. Marcus watched carefully for signs that she was calculating the inconvenience his request would cause her, or wondering what she might gain by helping him. Instead, he saw something that looked remarkably like genuine concern, the kind of empathy that couldn't be faked or manufactured for personal advantage. "Oh, honey," she said softly, her voice filled with the kind of compassion that came from someone who had experienced real loss and understood the weight of cherished memories. "Of course we can figure out something. Let me see what we're working with here." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, treating his request with the same seriousness she might give to a family member's crisis. Marcus handed her the letter, watching as she handled it with the reverence appropriate to a precious family heirloom. As she began to read, he studied her face for any sign that she recognized the deception, any indication that she saw through his carefully constructed story. Instead, what he saw was something that shook him to his core. As Eleanor read the letter, tears began to form in her eyes, not the crocodile tears of someone trying to manipulate a situation for personal gain, but the genuine emotional response of someone who was moved by another person's pain. She read slowly and carefully, clearly understanding that she was being trusted with something precious and irreplaceable. "This is beautiful," she whispered when she finished reading. "Your father loved you so much. You can feel it in every word. I can't imagine how much this means to you." She looked up at him with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "And I can absolutely help you preserve this. My daughter Sarah is studying graphic design at the community college, and she has access to high-quality scanners and printers. She could make you several copies that would look almost identical to the original, and we could laminate the original to protect it from any more wear." Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, a feeling he couldn't immediately identify. "I couldn't ask you to involve your daughter in my problems," he said, though part of him desperately wanted to accept her offer. "And I should mention that I don't have much money to pay for something like that." Elena waved away his concerns with the kind of dismissive gesture that suggested money was the least important consideration in her decision to help. "Don't you worry about payment. Sarah would be thrilled to help with a project like this. She's always looking for ways to practice her skills, and this would mean so much more to her than just another class assignment. Besides," she added with a smile that seemed to light up the entire diner, "some things are more important than money. This letter is part of your history, your connection to your father. That's precious in a way that can't be measured in dollars." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his world, everything had a price. Every favor came with expectations. Every act of kindness was performed with the anticipation of future reciprocation. The idea that someone would go out of their way to help a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do was so foreign to his experience that he struggled to process it. "Why would you do this for me?" he asked, genuine confusion coloring his voice. "You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone. I could be lying about this whole story." Elena looked at him with an expression that was equal parts surprise and gentle amusement. "Honey, I've been working in restaurants for over 25 years. I've learned to read people pretty well, and I can tell that this letter means everything to you. The way you handle it, the way your voice changes when you talk about your father, that's not something you can fake. And even if you could, even if this was all some elaborate lie, what would I be risking by helping you preserve an old piece of paper?" She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. "I've learned that most people are carrying around pain that others can't see. We all need help sometimes, and we all deserve to be treated with kindness, regardless of our circumstances. If I can make your burden a little lighter, if I can help you hold on to something that connects you to someone you loved, then that's worth far more to me than whatever small inconvenience it might cause." Marcus stared at her, trying to reconcile this simple philosophy with the cutthroat world he had inhabited for decades. In his experience, people helped others only when it advanced their own interests or when they could afford to be generous without any real sacrifice. The idea that Elena would involve her daughter in helping a complete stranger would take time away from her own family and responsibilities simply because she believed it was the right thing to do, challenged everything he thought he knew about human nature. "There has to be something you want in return," he pressed, unable to accept that her offer could be completely altruistic. "Some way this benefits you that I'm not seeing." Eleanor's smile softened, and she reached across the table to gently touch his hand, a gesture that was comforting rather than presumptuous. "The only thing I want is for you to feel a little less alone in the world. I lost my husband 3 years ago, and I know what it's like to desperately want to hold on to every piece of someone you've loved. If I can help you keep your father's words safe, if I can make sure that letter survives to be passed down to your children or grandchildren someday, then that's all the reward I need." The mention of her husband's death sent a new wave of emotion through Marcus. Here was a woman who had experienced profound loss, who was clearly struggling financially based on her employment at a late-night diner, and yet her instinct was to help others rather than focus on her own problems. The contrast with his own response to loss, his retreat into wealth and isolation, was stark and uncomfortable. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly, meaning it more than any condolence he had ever offered in his professional life. "It must be difficult, managing everything on your own." Elena's expression grew wistful, but there was strength in her voice when she responded. "It is difficult, but I'm not alone. I have Sarah, and I have this community. The people who come through that door every day, they're not just customers, they're part of my extended family. Mrs. Patterson brings me vegetables from her garden when they're in season. Tommy, the night security guard at the hospital, always checks to make sure I get to my car safely when I close late. The Hernandez family sends me a Christmas card every year with a note about how I helped them when they were going through a rough patch." She paused, looking around the diner with genuine affection. "I know this place doesn't look like much, but it's where people come when they need more than just food. It's where they come when they need to feel like someone cares, whether they're having a good day or a bad day, whether they're celebrating something special or trying to forget something painful. And being part of that, being able to make people feel a little less alone in the world, that gives my life meaning in a way that nothing else could." Marcus found himself studying Elena with new eyes, seeing past the modest uniform and working-class surroundings to recognize something he had spent his entire adult life searching for without realizing it. A sense of purpose that went beyond personal achievement. A connection to others that wasn't based on what they could do for him, but on what he could do for them. The realization was both inspiring and devastating, forcing him to confront the emptiness that had grown larger with each passing year despite his increasing wealth and success. "You make it sound so simple," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But how do you maintain that kind of faith in people? How do you keep believing in goodness when you've seen so much pain and loss?" Elena considered the question seriously, her weathered hands folding the letter carefully and placing it back in its envelope. "I suppose it's because I've learned that we all have a choice about how we respond to the difficulties life throws at us. We can let our pain make us bitter and suspicious, or we can let it make us more compassionate toward others who are struggling. We can focus on what we've lost, or we can focus on what we still have to give." She looked directly at him, her eyes holding a depth of understanding that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Your father's letter, even though he had to give you up, even though circumstances forced him to make an impossible choice, he took the time to write down his love for you. He made sure you would know that you mattered to him, that letting you go was the hardest thing he ever had to do. That's not the action of a man who didn't care. That's the action of a man who loved you so much that he was willing to sacrifice his own happiness for your well-being." The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt something fundamental shifting inside him. For 40 years, he had interpreted his biological father's abandonment as rejection, as evidence that he wasn't worth fighting for. But Eleanor's perspective offered a different possibility, that giving him up had been an act of love rather than indifference, a sacrifice made by a man who wanted better for his son than he could provide. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion that surprised him with its intensity. "I always assumed he just didn't want the responsibility of raising a child." "Oh, honey," Elena said gently. "No one who didn't want a child would take the time to write a letter like this. Every word shows how much he cared about you, how much it hurt him to let you go. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when you can't give someone what they need and making sure they get it from someone who can." Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time in years. overwhelmed by the kindness of this woman who had taken his fictional story and responded with such genuine compassion. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had come here to test her integrity, to see if she would try to take advantage of someone she believed to be vulnerable and alone. Instead, she was offering comfort and wisdom that cut to the heart of pain he had carried for decades. "Can I ask you something?" he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "If you knew that someone was testing you, trying to see if you were the kind of person who would help a stranger in need, would that change how you responded?" Elena tilted her head, considering the question with the same seriousness she had given to his request for help with the letter. "I suppose it would depend on why they were testing me. If someone was trying to see if they could trust me with something important, then I'd hope I would pass their test by being the person I try to be every day. If someone was testing me because they'd been hurt by people who let them down, then I'd want to show them that not everyone is untrustworthy." She paused, studying his face with growing understanding. "But if someone was testing me because they'd become so isolated and cynical that they couldn't believe in genuine kindness anymore, then I think I'd be heartbroken for them. Because that would mean they'd lived in a world where they'd been surrounded by people who only cared about what they could get, and they'd forgotten that there are still folks who care about what they can give." Marcus felt exposed, as if Elena could see right through the careful facade he had constructed. Her words were hitting uncomfortably close to the truth about his motivations for being here, about the experiments he had been conducting for the past 2 years. But instead of feeling manipulated or judged, he felt understood in a way that was both terrifying and liberating. "What if I told you," he said slowly, "that I came here tonight specifically to test whether you would help someone you thought was poor and alone? What if I told you that I've been conducting similar tests all over the city, trying to find evidence that genuine kindness still exists?" Elena's expression didn't change, but she leaned back slightly in her chair, processing this revelation. When she spoke, her voice was gentle rather than accusatory. "Then I'd say you must have been very hurt by someone, somewhere along the way, to make you feel like you needed to test people's goodness. And I'd say that the fact you're still looking for kindness, still hoping to find it, means that part of you hasn't given up on humanity yet." Marcus felt something break open inside him, a wall he had been building for decades suddenly crumbling under the weight of Elena's compassion. "The letter," he said quietly, "it's not exactly what I told you it was." "I know," Elena replied simply. "The handwriting is too consistent for someone who was supposedly dying, and the paper is aged, but not in the way something 40 years old would be. But that doesn't matter, because I can tell that your pain about your father is real, and that's what I was responding to." Marcus stared at her, amazed by her perceptiveness, and even more amazed by her reaction. "You knew I was lying, and you were still going to help me. Honey, people lie for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes they lie because they're trying to hurt others, and sometimes they lie because they're trying to protect themselves. You struck me as someone who was protecting himself, testing the waters to see if it was safe to trust another human being with something that mattered to you. The specific details of your story weren't as important as the fact that you needed to know if there were still people in the world who would care about your well-being." Elena reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers, her calloused palms warm against his soft skin. "So let me ask you this. Have you found what you were looking for? Have you learned something tonight that might help you believe in goodness again?" Marcus looked into her eyes and saw something he hadn't encountered in years: unconditional acceptance. Not the fawning attention he received from people who wanted something from him, not the calculated interest of business associates who saw him as useful, but genuine care for his well-being as a human being. It was overwhelming and humbling and beautiful all at once. "I don't know if I deserve what you're offering me," he said honestly. I've spent so many years focused on accumulating wealth and power that I'm not sure I remember how to be the kind of person who deserves kindness." "Everyone deserves kindness," Elena replied firmly. "That's not something you have to earn or prove you're worthy of. That's something you deserve just by virtue of being human, of being someone who's struggling and trying to make sense of their place in the world." She squeezed his hands gently. "But I will say this, if you've learned something here tonight, if you've remembered what it feels like to be on the receiving end of genuine care, then you have a choice about what you do with that knowledge. You can go back to your old life and treat this as an interesting anomaly, or you can let it change how you move through the world." Marcus felt a profound shift happening inside him, as if Eleanor's words were rewiring something fundamental about how he understood himself and his relationship to others. For the first time in decades, he was beginning to see a path forward that didn't involve isolation and cynicism, a way of living that might actually bring him the connection and meaning he had been unconsciously seeking for so long. "Can I tell you the truth?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "The whole truth this time?" Elena nodded encouragingly. "I'm listening." Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak, the words coming slowly at first, but then gathering momentum as he found himself unburdening secrets he had never shared with another human being. He told her about his adoption, about the real letter from his biological father, about his lifelong quest to understand why he had been abandoned. He told her about building his business empire, about the wealth and success that had never filled the emptiness inside him, about the failed marriages and the increasing isolation that had characterized his adult life. Most importantly, he told her about the humanity experiments, about his systematic testing of people's willingness to help others, about his growing conviction that kindness was extinct in the modern world. As he spoke, Elena listened without judgment, her expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something that looked remarkably like compassion for the lonely man he had revealed himself to be. When he finished speaking, the diner was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the wet streets outside. Eleanor sat quietly for several moments, processing everything he had told her, and Marcus found himself holding his breath as he waited for her response. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," she said finally. "I can see how much courage it took to share all of that, and I'm honored that you felt safe enough here to let down your guard." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I have to tell you, I'm heartbroken that you've lived so many years believing that people are fundamentally selfish and untrustworthy. Because from where I sit, I see something very different when I look at you." "What do you see?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "I see someone who spent his whole life searching for the father who loved him enough to let him go. I see someone who built an empire but never forgot where he came from, who's wealthy enough to insulate himself from everyone else's problems, but chose instead to walk among people who are struggling to see if anyone would show him compassion. I see someone who came here tonight expecting to be disappointed and instead found exactly what he's been looking for his whole life." Elena's words hit him with the force of revelation. She was right. Despite all his cynicism and isolation, despite his conviction that people were fundamentally selfish, he had continued searching for evidence of goodness. The very fact that he was conducting these experiments proved that part of him still believed in the possibility of genuine kindness, still hoped to find the human connection he had been missing for so long. "You're giving me far more credit than I deserve," Marcus said quietly. "I've made a lot of mistakes, hurt a lot of people through my selfishness and ambition." "Maybe so," Elena replied. "But you're here now, having this conversation, looking for ways to understand and connect with other people. That tells me something important about who you are underneath all that success and wealth. You're someone who still cares about being a good human being, even if you've lost your way for a while. Marcus felt tears finally spilling down his cheeks, decades of suppressed emotion overwhelming his carefully maintained composure. Elena didn't comment on his tears or try to comfort him in a way that would make him self-conscious about his vulnerability. She simply sat with him, her presence steady and reassuring, while he processed the magnitude of what was happening inside him. "I don't know how to be different," he admitted when he could speak again. "I don't know how to live in a way that honors what you've shown me tonight." Elena smiled, and in that smile, Marcus saw infinite possibility. You don't have to figure it all out at once. You just have to start with the next choice you make, and then the choice after that. Every day, you get to decide whether you're going to use your wealth and influence to build walls or bridges, whether you're going to focus on accumulating more for yourself or finding ways to make other people's lives a little easier. She stood up from the table and began gathering the coffee cups, her movements easy and natural despite the profound conversation they had just shared. "But I will say this, if you're serious about wanting to change, about wanting to find a way to live that brings you real satisfaction and connection, then you might want to start by looking for the people in your life who need help but would never ask for it. The ones who are working multiple jobs to support their families, who are caring for elderly parents while raising children, who are struggling to make ends meet despite doing everything right." Marcus watched her move around the diner, struck by the contrast between her modest circumstances and the richness of her wisdom. Here was someone who had far less in terms of material possessions, but far more in terms of what actually mattered: community, purpose, the ability to make others feel valued and cared for. "Can I ask you something?" he said, as she returned to wipe down his table. "If you knew that helping someone could change not just their life, but dozens of other lives as well, would that influence how much effort you put into helping them?" Eleanor paused in her cleaning, considering the question. "I'd want to help them regardless. But I suppose knowing that my actions could have that kind of ripple effect would make me even more committed to doing everything I could." "Why do you ask?" Marcus pulled out his wallet, but instead of reaching for cash to pay for his coffee, he withdrew a business card and placed it on the table between them. Elena picked it up and read it, her eyes widening as she processed the information printed there. "Marcus Blackwell, CEO, Blackwell Industries. You're—" She started, then stopped, looking back and forth between the card and his face. "You're that Marcus Blackwell, the one whose company built half the buildings downtown." Marcus nodded, feeling strangely nervous about her reaction. In his experience, people's behavior changed dramatically when we finished the first part here. Comment if you want part 2.